Good evening, everyone. Welcome again to another live streaming of basic transfer pricing. And today I would like to say thank you to our subscribers, no? Umabot na tayo ng 400, 481 subscribers, no? So thank you very much, and we will be scheduling another 2-day seminar for this transfer pricing, no, especially on documentation. I-schedule natin yan, Hari, on March. No, i-post po bukas and then i-post natin para mas maraming attend. Kasi I want to address na lang pasensya na doon sa ibang maraming mga tanong about transfer pricing, maraming mga queries that needs explanation, no? Hindi ko kayang sagutin lahat because it's so long. Kaya ang gagawin ko, attend na lang po kayo doon sa 2-day seminar and we will answer every questions that you have in your mind, especially yung bagong requirements po ngayon ng BAR, which is the BAR Form 1709 on the transfer pricing documentation. No, i-discuss natin thoroughly sino ba yung hindi dapat, kasi ang daming magsasabi, ma'am, hindi naman pala kami subject. Hindi, tingnan natin. You might otherwise consider na subject pala kayo, no? So we will continue our discussion on this case, the AgraCity versus the Canadian Revenue Agency or the Queen, no? Yung government ng Canada. And what is this case all about, no? So before we proceed with our discussion, tingnan muna natin ano ba itong kaso na to for those na mga bago nating subscribers, no? Shout out, Hari.
Wala pa pong shout out.
Ilan na yung viewers?
8 viewers.
Okay, so we have 8 viewers. Shout out po sa mga viewers natin. And before we proceed with our discussions, ano nga ba nangyari dito sa AgraCity versus the Canadian Revenue Agency? No, ang nangyari dito, yung founder ng Farmer of North America, si Jason Mann, nagkaroon siya ng company, nag-set up po siya ng company sa yung AGCO US in order to provide yung needs ng mga farmers sa Canada, no? Ano yung sinusupply nila, yung clear out, yung isang herbicides yun na ginagamit ng mga farmers. Ang aim dito ni Jason Mann is to have supplies for the farmers na competitive at mura yung pagkakuha nila. So since they buy in volume sa US, nakakapagkuman sila ng lower price compared to the herbicides sold in Canada. So, paano nila ginawa yun? Nagkaroon sila ng license na on-use import. So, ang ibig sabihin, ang mag-import, yung individual partner, hindi nila pambenta, kundi panggamit sa kanilang farm, no? So, yung on-use import, yun ang nagiging vehicle ng mga farmers in order to acquire ng herbicide, yung clear out ang brand, no? Clear out herbicides from America. So, ang nangyari, nakakamura sila at itong clear out, wala siyang license to sell sa Canada. So, ano ang license na nagkaroon? On-use import or OUI. Itong OUI, ito yung binibigay na pinaka-authority or permit para sa mga farmers na magkaroon sila ng their own importation, no? On-use import. So, in short, walang available na clear out sa Canada na for sale, no? Available lang itong clear out na herbicide sa US na doon bibilhin ng mga farmers directly, no? Sila mismo mag-i-import. Pero yung supply sa Canada na mga clear outs, herbicides, walang available, no? And ano lang yung pinapahintulutan na magkaroon ng on-use import or OUI. Ito yung mga product which has the same content or which has the same product category with that already licensed in Canada. So since itong clear out na herbicides, meron na siyang kapareho na mga product na nasa Canada na for sale. So pinayagan siya na mag-import, no, para sa consumption lang ng mga farmers, hindi nila pambenta kung hindi panggamit lang. So anong ginawa dito ni Jason Man? Ginawa dito ni Jason Man, since hindi makapag-import ang mga farmers ng sarili nila at saka walang mga businessman na pwedeng mag-import na ibenta itong clear out sa Canada, ang ginawa niya, nag-set up siya ng company sa US, itong Agco US, wherein yun ang naghahanap ng supplies sa Amerika ng clear out, no? And then nagkaroon siya ng warehouse doon. Doon niya nilalagay yung mga herbicides na yan. And then from the warehouse na tinatag niya sa Dakota, yun yung nagdi-deliver ngayon sa Canada nung clear out na herbicides. Pero hindi para pambenta, kung hindi para pang supply consumption ng mga farmers. At ang nag-i-import dito, yun mismong mga farmers, no, through the OUI or own use import, no. So ano nangyari dito later on? Later on, ang si AgraCity, meron pa siyang isang company, no, yung sa Saskatchewan, no, Saskatchewan Ltd. Pero nag-appeal din ito dito sa korte dahil na-assess din sila ng Canadian Revenue Agency, pero na-concede na yung Canadian Revenue Agency doon sa Saskatchewan. So wala nang wala nang case. Ang natuloy na lang na appeal itong sa AgraCity, no? So sa AgraCity po, if you try to read pa more about the case, nagkaroon pa siya ng establish pa siya ng iba pang company sa Barbados, no? Yung Agco Barbados, no? Na ang nangyari naman, yung mga inventories, lahat ng US Agco nandoon na sa Agco Barbados. Lahat ng sales, lahat ng income nawala na sa US kasi binenta na niya sa Agco Barbados. And considering that Agco Barbados mas lower yung tax, no? So doon nagtipid yung company. Nilipat niya sa Agco Barbados, wala na sa Agco US. And then ano yung ginawa dito ng Canadian Revenue Agency? Ang ginawa po ng Canadian Revenue Agency dito, na nagkaroon siya ng assessment para sa AgraCity. Kasi dito sa transaction na to, ang AgraCity is a company based in Canada. Ang role niya po dito ay delivery lang, no? At binabayaran siya ng 10 to 20 cents lang per liter para doon sa kanyang effort to deliver the clear out herbicides sa mga farmers sa Canada, no? So, ang sabi ng Canadian Revenue Agency, napakaliit ng payment ng Agco Barbados to AgraCity, kung considering na yung AgraCity na company based in Canada, siya lahat ang gumagawa ng functions, no? Nasa kanya yung delivery, nasa kanya yung pagbigay ng mga stocks, pati yung collection, no? Nasa kanya lahat. So sabi ng Canada, Canadian Revenue Agency, since lahat ng activities ay si AgraCity ang gumagawa, dapat lang na mas malaki yung bayad sa kanya. Kasi ang Agco Barbados, na doon nakapangalan, doon napunta sa kanya lahat ng income ng transactions, ang nangyayari ay is a shell company, no? Kasi wala naman siyang mga employee, tapos wala naman siyang operation sa Agco Barbados. Ang lahat ng operation nasa Canada naman, no? So lahat ng kita, lahat ng income pumupunta lang sa Agco Barbados, pero ang lahat ng business activities nandito sa Canada. So anong sabi ng Canadian Revenue Agency? Itong mga income na dapat naka Agco Barbados, dapat nasa AgraCity. At ang sabi nila, the transaction number 1, no, ang mga allegations ng Region Revenue Agency, number 1, the transaction is a sham transaction. Ibig sabihin, ginawa lang yan para lokohin yung Canadian Revenue Agency na ito si Agco Barbados ang may income when in fact it is the income of AgraCity. Why AgraCity? Because lahat ng commercial and financial transactions na nangyayari, si AgraCity lahat ang gumagawa. Si Agco Barbados tumatanggap lang, no, ng collection. And then yung pangalawang allegations or contention ng gusto mangyari ng Canadian Revenue Agency is that yung income ng Agco Barbados i-recharacterize. Ibig sabihin na i-recharacterize niya, ibahin niya ang nature at dapat na kay AgraCity yon. So si Agco Barbados dapat walang participation doon sa income kasi niwalaan siyang employee and Agco Barbados is just a shell company, no? Parang pina-register lang siya doon sa Barbados pero wala talaga siyang operations doon. Lahat ng operations nasa Canada. No? And then ang number 3 na demand or gusto ng Canadian Revenue Agency is magkaroon ng adjustment, no, ng income. So paano magkaroon ng adjustment? I-reassess yung income ni AgraCity, yung income coming from Agco Barbados, dapat kay AgraCity yan, and then magbayad sila ng deficiency taxes. Saan po sila magbayad ng deficiency taxes? Sa Canada. Okay? Na. May ano?
Belated Happy Valentine's.
May pahabol pa, no? Main ka na dyan. Okay. So, mamaya ka na umalis kasi ang daming discuss sa transfer pricing. Yung para sa is-isi na kuhanin ng mga ano, no? Okay. Say hi to our YouTubers.
Oh, hello.
Dito sa may ano, sa may kamera. Nakikita na siya? Okay. So hi po. Siya po yung ating anong tawag dito, Hari?
Keep stop.
Siya po yung on-call service natin. Siya po yung on-call service po natin, no? Tumutulong sa atin, especially yung mga lakad sa is-isi. Ang hirap talaga ngayon, no?
Wapo pala sa ano.
Tuloy po tayo sa ating discussion po sa AgraCity. So ano nangyari po dito? Since nag-demand po yung Canadian Revenue Agency na magkaroon ng reassessment, adjust the income of AgraCity, no? Yung nakalagay na income sa Agco Barbados, ilagay na sa income ng AgraCity. So anong ginawa ng AgraCity? Pumunta na po sila sa appeal, no? Hindi sila na sa korte, hindi na sila pumayag doon sa contention or allegations po ng Canadian Revenue Agency. So in this case, since this is just an appeal, ano po yung nangyari dito? Nanalo dito yung AgraCity, no? Pinanigan sila ng korte at ang sabi ng korte that the transaction is not a sham transaction kasi lahat ng sales walang nawawala. It is recorded at ang sabi pa ng korte, hindi nga daw nagreklamo yung US Agco or the US government when in fact sila yung nawala ng income kasi ang nilipat na company is the US Agco, no? Nilipat nila sa Agco Barbados. So hindi nga daw nagreklamo yung US, the IRS. So okay lang yan, tama daw yun transactions. And lahat ng transactions, lahat ng sales were properly recorded in the books of Agco Barbados, no? So walang nawawala daw na transactions, lahat are properly accounted. That's why hindi mo matawag na sham transaction. Okay, so yun naman po yung contention ng AgraCity. That's why hindi sila pinanigan sila ng korte, no? So in tonight, tuloy po natin tingnan natin kung ano nangyari sa transactions at kasi ang importante talaga dito, no, nakita ko sa gumagawa na ako ngayon ng mga transfer pricing analysis report. What is really very important is that kompleto sa documentation ang transactions, no? Properly recorded siya, and then lahat ng mga statutory requirements ng government na follow, na sunod ng taxpayer. So, kahit na magkaroon man later on ng transfer pricing audit, malamang na mananalo pa rin yung taxpayers, no? And then, the role also of the expert witness. Sinabi din po dito, bakit? Ano po yung role ng expert witness? Yung expert witness po dito is, ano din yung kanilang testimony in favor also of the AgraCity, no? Okay. So, anong nangyari po dito sa AgraCity na to, no? So, balikan natin. Okay. Kasi ito yung mga kine-question ng Canadian Revenue Agency, the agreement between the AGCO Barbados and the AgraCity, na maliit lang daw yung binabayad ng AGCO Barbados sa AgraCity, when in fact, it is AgraCity who is doing all the functions, no? So, ano ba itong naging service agreement? The service agreement between AgraCity and the new AGCO Barbados appears to be a valid contractual agreement. Yun yung findings na po ng court. Setting out in a very large measure what AgraCity was responsible for doing and what it in fact did, as well as how AgraCity was to be paid for performing those services. Kasi ang service agreement nila ng AgraCity at saka ng AGCO Barbados are valid. As compared doon sa case ng Coke na na-discuss na natin, na sinundan nitong AgraCity, di ba yung Coke natin na 5 days natin na tayo nag-live streaming doon. Ano nangyari naman doon sa mga service agreements na ginawa ng butlers at saka yung supply point ng Coke? Hindi ma-enforce. Why? Because it lacks consideration, malabo. Dito naman, ang finding ng court dito sa service agreement between AgraCity and New AGCO, valid ang contractual agreement. Kasi, ang sabi niya, na nakalagay talaga sa kontrata kung ano yung gagawin ng AgraCity at magkano siya babayaran ng AGCO Barbados. No? Okay. There is no requirement that such a contract or agreement be in writing, nor is there a requirement that such an agreement be specifically crafted for accuracy by highly paid retained professionals. Even if it involves millions of dollars, yun ang batas sa kanila. The two businessmen in Saskatchewan operating their owner-managed businesses would take a precedent from the internet for an intercompany services agreement should hardly surprise anyone, much less concern them very much. This agreement specifies the services to be provided as those that were in fact provided. Promotion and the provision of administrative services related to the sale of clear out in Canada being specifically detailed as promotion, no? Invoicing, collection of receivables, payment of supplier invoices, bookkeeping services, logistics, border services, reporting, and any other services agreed to from time to time. So, properly laid out in the service agreement yung gagawin ng party at saka yung ibabayad ng other party for as a consideration for that services, no? So the service fee in the services agreement was specified as 10 cents per liter, no? So yun ang bayad doon sa serbisyo po ng AgraCity, and may be reviewed from time to time and adjusted as mutually agreed by the parties. The two related parties would sit down at year-end and ensure the service fee generated a reasonable profit above the service provider's cost, should not be surprising or of much concern. They did this twice, no? They did this twice na. increasing it first to 15 cents for the first year and thereafter to 20 cents. These increases were subsequently duly ratified by New Agco Barbados. No? So, Board of Directors, it is easy for non-arm's length related parties to readily agree to prices and fees without open market forces constraining them. That is precisely why the Act requires such amounts to be reasonable and to reflect fair market value and in cross-border circumstances. The very reason for the Act's transfer pricing rules, which were relied on by the respondent in reassessing as an alternative in this court, and which are addressed separately below. The non-arm's length setting and adjusting of prices is not at least in this case. Kasi ang sabi dito ng korte, yung bayad niya na 10 cents per liter, napakaliit for the services na ginagawa ng AgraCity, considering na napakarami niyang ginagawa, and then 10 cents lang per liter yung service fee niya. No? The non-arm's length setting and adjusting of prices is not, at least in this case, able to construed as evidence of a sham if the legal definition of sham is properly understood and applied. No? So, kahit ganun pa naman daw yun, hindi yun qualify sa transaction as a sham transaction or yung transaction na panluloko lang. Nor can it, at least in this case, be construed as window dressing. No? Hindi mo rin makonstrue na window dressing lang siya if the legal definition of window dressing is properly understood and considered. No? Kasi hindi mo masabi na window dressing lang siya kasi properly documented. No? Kaya nga ang ginagawa natin ngayon, transfer pricing documentation. No? Talagang yung mga ginagawa ko na transfer pricing analysis report as compared noong wala pa tayong clear guidelines just like the RAMO 1-2019 at saka yung ngayon meron na tayong yung RR 34-2020 for the guidelines on how to submit this 1709 na report. So mas ginawa ko na ngayon yung aking transfer pricing analysis mas detailed na. No? And then ginagawa ko yung 5 comparability factors are properly explained and applied to the company. No? Kasi gusto ko lahat ng kailangan na during the audit na answer ko na when I made the transfer pricing analysis report. No? Why? Kasi in-anticipate ko na any time na magkaroon na ng dispute, yung halimbawa transfer pricing assessment na yung taxpayer, ikaw yung gumawa ng transfer pricing analysis report mo, be sure na ready ka na pumunta sa korte. And ikaw yung tatanungin ng korte kung paano mo ginawa yung report mo na nag-recommend ka na arm's length transactions ang nangyari doon sa company na gumawa ka ng transfer pricing analysis report. So, be ready with your documentation and with your reason kung bakit. And documentation is really very, very important. So, with the expert witness. No? Silang dalawa, documentation and the expert witness. Sino yung expert witness? Ito yung mga industry expert. No? So, pagka meron ka ng ganun, malamang na fair trial, may laban ka na sa court. No? So, many Canadian businesses have what a respondent may describe as confused books and records. No? Kasi yung mga businesses daw may confused books and records. Why confused? Talagang malabo. The Act specifies that adequate books and records must be kept, but too many appeals to this court regularly prove that Canadians often fall short. So, ibig sabihin, yung mga taxpayers daw sa Canada, hindi sila maintain ng records, no, ng mga books and records. Confusing, incomplete, or inadequate records create challenges for CRA at the verification stage. Why? Kasi ang sabi nga natin, transfer pricing cases are factual. And when we say factual, dapat mapakita ka talaga ng record. So, very important the role of documentation. And challenges for taxpayer and judges when the dispute reaches the court. Kasi, saan ba pupunta yung kaso pag hindi na magkasundo yung BAR or the examiner at saka the taxpayer? Pupunta na yun sa korte. No? So, sino na yung magiging referee doon sa case? The judges. So, both, sana magkakatalo doon sa documentation na. Saan na mga nakita ko na mga cases na natatalo pagdating na sa korte, they lack documentation. They just have an allegation, pero kulang ng documentation. They are not on their own evidence of a sham unless their inaccuracies, inconsistencies, and or omissions can be shown to favor a particular but clearly inaccurate recording of the parties' rights, obligations, revenues, and others. In this case, they do not, no? Sa case daw ng AgraCity, sabi ng court, hindi daw siya, wala daw inaccuracies, inconsistencies, or omission, no? That will show to favor a particular inaccurate recording of the parties. So, yun ang sabi ng court. On the issue naman of transfer pricing recharacterization, kasi ano bang nangyari dito sa transfer pricing recharacterization na to? Ang gusto ng Canadian Revenue Agency na yung income ng New Agco Barbados i-adjust at ibibigay siya sa AgraCity dahil income daw talaga yun ng AgraCity at saka itong Agco Barbados ginawa lang para i-shift or i-divert yung income ng AgraCity sa Agco Barbados. So, anong gusto nila? I-recharacterize. Ibig sabihin lang na wala ng income yung Agco Barbados, ibigay kay AgraCity at para doon babayaran ng tax sa Canada. Kasi ang AgraCity is a company based in Canada. So, one of the express requirements for recharacterization is that non-arm's length parties must be participants in a transaction or series of transactions that would not have been entered into between arm's length persons. That is, the issue of concern to the fees is not simply the price or other terms agreed to by the parties. It is that very transactions, no, agreed to and completed by the parties would not have been entered into between persons dealing with arm's length. No? So, yun yung contention. The requirement that this prerequisite to recharacterization be proved was most recently considered by the Federal Court of Appeal in Cameco. Meron na din tayong case na explain na ito yung case ng Cameco, no, dito sa YouTube channel natin na Basic Transfer Pricing. As set out above, Justice Webb correctly rejected the Crown argument that this could be more broadly interpreted or applied than is written. Since the reassessment were made as transfer pricing adjustment under paragraph 247 and C, 2A and C, it is not surprising that there are no factual assumptions in the amended reply. So, walang factual assumptions to support the respondent's position that arm's length parties would not have entered into this transaction, at least not that separate from the assumptions made in support of the sham or transfer pricing quantum adjustment position of the respondent. The amended reply does raise the additional fact that the new Agco Barbados did not perform any function in the series of transactions for which an arm's length party would pay. No? Sabi nila talaga hindi naman tumutulong yung new Agco Barbados doon sa functions. No? Lahat AgraCity ang gumagawa. Ito na ang role ng expert. Anong sabi dito? The respondent expert's report of Mr. Roger San does not address this either. His two sure rebuttal reports do not clearly do so either in a way that includes any factual data, evidence, assumptions, or conclusions. His reports still focus on the absence of any function for new Agco Barbados in the transactions, even though it is the buyer of the clear out from Albo and the seller of the clear out to Canadian farmers. No? His report is structured entirely as a functional analysis to support his opinion. The transfer pricing adjustment under paragraph 247 and A and C are warranted. The respondent's position on paragraph 247, 2B, and D, recharacterization is effectively that it's obvious that arm's length commercial parties would never agree to let new Agco Barbados have any of the profits. It served no function. Kasi wala namang ginagawa ka mo yung sabi ng CRA yung Agco Barbados. So, dapat wala siyang profit, no? In the transactions given that it had no assets, employees, resources, or other role. Kasi wala siyang assets. Ang New Angko Barbados, wala siyang resources, wala siyang empleyado, wala siyang role doon sa transactions, no? So, or other role or value to contribute to the profit-making enterprise or to bring thereto. Parang ano ka, masaya ka, wala kang ginawa, tapos lahat ng profit na sa'yo. No? So, Respondents' Counsel acknowledged that its position on recharacterization was dependent upon the same interpretation or understanding of the facts and evidence and somewhat similar argument as their primary position on sham. So, the absence of evidence provided to the court to support the respondent's position that arm's-length parties would not enter into the transaction is alone sufficient to dismiss this first alternate argument given the findings above that New Angko Barbados had assets and resources involved in the transactions and took on real risk in respect of the transactions. Ito na yung role naman ng comparables, no? Kasi ano ba sabi natin sa arm's-length principle? Arm's-length principle will tell us that the transactions between related parties should be at par or similar with that of the independent parties. And in this case, walang maipakita ang respondent or the Canadian Revenue Agency of an independent transactions similar to these transactions between the AgraCity and the New Angko Barbados, similar transactions which will show kung ano yung gagawin kung independent party yung parties into that same transactions. Wala silang mapakitang comparable. No? So, in short, hindi mo ma-apply dito yung arm's length principle. However, Mr. Rogerson, after identifying that the service agreement between New Angko Barbados and AgraCity was the transaction under review in his report, so agreed in his testimony that the services agreement subject to proper pricing was a contract to which arm's length parties would agree. No? So, anong sabi ng korte? Itong nangyari na between New Angko Barbados and AgraCity, ito yung kontrata na arm's length parties, meaning independent parties, would agree. Papahayag sila sa ganitong klaseng agreement, no? So he continued by explaining that proper arm's length pricing would only see New Angko Barbados reimbursed for its out-of-pocket arm's length expenses of cost of product, warehouse and transport fees, accounting and legal fees, incorporation fees, cost of meeting of its board of directors and others with no profit component whatsoever. Ayaw nilang bigyan ng income si Angko Barbados, no? Effectively allocating all of the net profits from the clear-out sales to AgraCity. Yan ang gusto ng Canadian Revenue Agency. Walang profit si Angko Barbados, lahat ng profit na kay AgraCity. Siyempre, dahil sila yung tax authority ng AgraCity because AgraCity is registered in Canada. So, lahat ng taxes na dapat bayaran ni AgraCity, babayaran niya sa Canada. The reason he gave in testimony was as set out in his report. New Angko Barbados performed no function of any value, describing it as the holder of the buy-sell contract. That New Angko Barbados is an entity that adds value by its existence only. Anong nangyari daw dito sa Barbados? Nag-exist lang siya kasi pinaregister siya, pero wala talaga siyang ginagawa, wala siyang tulong doon sa business transactions. The expert opinion testimony of Mr. Rogerson is a further reason for dismissing the respondent first alternate transfer pricing argument. Anong first na argument? Yung sham transaction daw, yung transaction between AgraCity and New Angko Barbados, no? Okay. Especially given the findings on the involvement of New Angko Barbados and its assets, resources, and exposure in the clear-out sales transaction and in creating the clear-out sales profits in question. So there was nothing in any of the appellant expert reports or testimony that could provide material support for the respondent position that the transactions in questions were not transactions that arm's-length parties would have entered into. No? Okay. So, yun ang contention ng korte. No? Panig sila or nasa side sila ng taxpayer. Okay, so transfer pricing adjustment amounts, ito yung issue, another issue, no? Yung assessment. Okay, the Rogerson Economic Transfer Pricing Report. Oh. Ito si Rogerson, Mr. Rogerson is the expert witness. No? So Mr. Rogerson Economic Transfer Pricing Report sets out his report of opinion that the value created by the parties to the transactions did not align with what was credited to the AgraCity and New Agco Barbados. This opinion was based upon the fact he was asked to assume by the respondent. His expert opinion was that 100% of the net sales profits realized from the clear-out sales by New Agco Barbados to farmers of North America or FNA members should have been AgraCities, and none of those profits would have been to New Agcos had they been dealing at arm's length. Hindi daw arm's length ang sabi ng expert witness. Hindi daw arm's length kasi kung arm's length daw, talagang walang profit na mapupunta kay Agco Barbados kung hindi lahat mapunta kay AgraCity. Mr. Rogerson was provided with the following assumptions among others from the respondent for purposes of arriving at his opinion. Ano yung mga opinion ni expert witness? Sabi niya dito, ito yung mga assumptions. Number one assumption, Jason Mann negotiated the price of clear out with suppliers. Ito si Jason Mann, which is also the founder of the Farmers of North America. Siya yung nag-negotiate talaga ng price ng clear out with suppliers. At anong purpose? Bakit niya tinatag yung Farmers of North America? Para ma-alleviate yung buhay ng mga farmers. At ito nga, lalaki yung profits nila kasi lilit yung gastos nila dahil yung herbicides na ginagamit nila is cheaper, no, than the market. So, Rogerson Economic Transfer Pricing Report or main report at paragraph 43, Mr. Rogerson expressly relies on this in his functional analysis at paragraph 54 too, no? Yung mga ginagawa pala natin, Hari, na transfer pricing report, dapat may number na paragraph. Paragraph 1, 2, 3, 4, just like yung paragraph na ginagawa ng OECD transfer pricing guidelines, no? Kasi pagdating na sa korte, isa-cite niya kung anong number ng paragraph. No? Kaya dapat yung paragraph natin also must contain numbers, no? Para mas madali siyang i-cite pagdating na sa court. No? So, FNA staff or the Farmers of North America staff were establishing pricing flow for clear out main report at paragraph 44C. No? Mr. Rogerson expressly relies on this in his financial analysis, no? Ang naglalagay daw talaga ng pricing para sa clear out yung Farmers of North America, no? So, kasi kung titingnan mo, related parties po sila lahat. Bakit? Ang Farmers of North America, si Jason Mann ang nag-establish. Yung AgraCity sa Canada, ang nag-establish si Jason Mann at saka yung kanyang kapatid si James Mann, no? Ang New Agco Barbados sa kanila din at saka yung Agco US kanila din, no? Kaya lahat sila ay related parties. Okay. New Agco Barbados purchased clear out from Albo and also from other foreign suppliers. So, bumibili din sila ng clear out ng herbicide, not only doon sa isang malaking supplier nila na si Albo na dati CPT, binili ni Albo. So, ngayon yung Albo na yung kanilang suppliers. And also, mayroon pa silang ibang mga suppliers. New Agco Barbados sold clear out to FNA members throughout the period in question. No? New Agco Barbados was the entity contractually selling clear out to Canadian farmers. Main report at paragraph 58A. Contractually acquiring clear out, main report at paragraph 58B. Making the payments for clear out and for the transportation of clear out, main report, no? Si New Agco Barbados, siya yung contractually, ibig sabihin na sa kontrata, na siya yung nagbebenta ng clear out to Canadian farmers. At siya din yung nag-acquire ng clear out galing sa suppliers, no? At siya din yung gumagawa ng payment ng clear out para sa transportation. Sino yung nagtatransport dito? Si AgraCity, no? Si New Agco Barbados ang nagbabayad. Sandali lang ha. 5 minutes break. Okay. So, continue po tayo, no? Okay. Ang decision-making process daw, ito yung mga assumptions ng court, no? The decision-making process for New Agco Barbados was made in Canada by James Mann and Jason Mann, no? Kasi sila naman nag-establish kahit na yung Farmers of North America, sila din na nag-establish. And then Jason Mann had sole signing authority in respect of New Agco Barbados, no? Bank account, and was approving all payments to be made by New Agco Barbados. Kasi sino bang may-ari ng New Agco Barbados? Si James Mann din. Sino bang may-ari ng AgraCity? Si James Mann din. Sino yung may-ari ng Agco US? Si James Mann din. So ito yung tinatawag na related parties, no? So in 2006, AgraCity entered into the service agreement with New Agco Barbados to carry on the activities of selling clear out to FNA members. Sino ang FNA members na binibentahan? Established also by Jason Mann, no? So, Mr. Rogerson expressly relied on this when he wrote in his functional analysis in his main report at paragraph 53. New Agco Barbados entered into a service agreement with AgraCity under which AgraCity would carry out the activities of selling clear out to FNA members. Mr. Rogerson went on to state as part of the understanding of the commercial and financial relations and his functional analysis. So, kasi yung commercial and financial relations at saka yung functional analysis, pagka ginawa mo yun, makikita mo na dyan kung arm's length ba o hindi ang transactions, no? However, New Agco Barbados had no employees and therefore no ability to perform any functions. No? Kasi, di ba yung sa comparability factors natin, we have characteristic of goods and services, we have the functions, assets, and risks, the contractual terms, the economic conditions, the business strategies. So in this case, si New Agco Barbados, wala siyang employees kasi nga shell company lang siya. So anong ibig sabihin? Inability to perform function. Wala siyang function kasi paano siya makapag-function? Corporation lang siya tapos wala siyang employees. No? New Agco Barbados on the other hand did not bring a potential market, no, the farmers, a potential product. So ano ibig sabihin lang? Si Agco Barbados wala siyang market, wala din siyang product, no? Bakit nasaan lahat nandun kay AgraCity? A potential product or suppliers that were not already known and did not relieve AgraCity from performing any functions by performing them in its place. Therefore, there was no opportunity for New Agco Barbados to add value in the transaction or extract value from AgraCity. No? So, yun yung reason. New Agco Barbados performed no function and was therefore not able to either generate or retain any value for itself. No? So, paano siya magkaroon ng value for itself? Wala nga siyang empleyado. No? In the context of an arm's length pricing analysis. No? So, the functional analysis describes what each party to the transaction actually does. The functions performed taking account of assets used and risk assumed in the performance of those functions provides important information. Okay, while New Agco Barbados is contractually involved in the transactions, the functions required to carry out the clear-out transactions are all performed by other parties, no? Related and unrelated. The transactions to be priced comprise the interaction between New Agco Barbados and AgraCity and between these two entities. The least complex entity is New Agco Barbados as it performs no functions, uses no assets, and takes no risk. So pag gumawa ka ng tested party mo in your transfer pricing analysis, ano yung gagamitin mong tested party? Ito yung performing the least complex function. And in this case nga daw, ito si Agco Barbados. While New Agco Barbados is contractually involved in the transactions, the function required to carry out the clear-out transactions are all performed by the other entities, both related and unrelated. So in this case, New Agco Barbados was contractually buying and selling clear-out between arm's length parties. However, all of the functions required to actually buy and sell the clear-out were performed outside of New Agco Barbados, no, by AgraCity and the FFNA. So if you try to look at itong family of farmers of North America, ito din yung Farmers of North America na ang founder, si Jason Mann din at saka si James Mann, which are also the founder of these companies, no? Yung New Agco Barbados, AgraCity at saka Agco US. Okay, since New Agco Barbados perform no functions, we must look at two components of pricing of functions. They are contractually responsible. First, the value added by the parties actually performing the functions. And second, whether New Agco Barbados has an ability to add or retain value from having the functions flow through it. No? So in this situation, New Agco Barbados does not negotiate prices to either buy or sell clear out. So ito si Agco Barbados, dinadaan lang yung mga sales sa kanya, pero wala siyang capability to negotiate for the price, no? And even sa transaction, yung pagbenta na, yung pagbili at pagbenta na ng clear out herbicides, walang capacity to do it si Agco Barbados. The second issue is the arms and the ability to New Agco Barbados to generate or extract value from participants to the transactions. New Agco Barbados performs no functions and is not able to either generate or retain any value for itself in the context of an arm's length transfer pricing analysis. This would drive the transfer pricing to zero, with the exception that some arm's length parties are paid through New Agco Barbados. So in this testimony, therefore, Mr. Rogerson opined that an OECD functional analysis does not involve a narrow definition of a function and that it would include the use of assets and the assumption of risk. No? Sabi nila malabo pa daw yung OECD guidelines on the functional analysis. No? Kasi hindi niya sinabi kung ano talaga yung definition ng functions, kung kasama ba dyan yung use of assets, the assumption of risk. No? Okay. Okay, so Mr. Rogerson testified that in forming his opinion, he did not understand that clear out had to be sold to Canadian by a non-Canadian. No? Hindi niya alam na yung clear out ibebenta ng Canadian by a non-Canadian. Okay. Mr. Rogerson could not explain to the court his description in his report of New Angko Barbados as the holder of the buy-sell contract. He answered that New Angko Barbados was the entity that actually has the contract, so their name is on it. He would not answer whether his views New Angko Barbados to be something less than the buyer of the U.S. clear out and the seller of the clear out who owns the product in between. No? Kasi ganun talaga ang mga karamihan ng mga transfer pricing cases eh. No? May mga transactions na nawawala, may mga companies na siniset up, yun what we call as the conduit companies. Kaya nga pagdating sa transfer pricing analysis, lahat ng mga companies involved in the transactions, dapat talaga sila bigyan ng functional analysis, yung comparability factors na 5. No? Ako ina-apply ko talaga uneven sa mga segment. No? So, Mr. Rogerson confirmed that transactions under review for purposes of considering adjustment to the quantum of the amount charged are those provided for in the service agreement. And service agreement really play an important part, especially in the transactions. No? Kasi pagka hindi kompleto yung service agreement mo or malabo, it will stand scrutiny. It won't stand scrutiny in court, just like what happened sa Coca-Cola bottlers, no? Ano yung ginawa nila? Since related parties lang sila, binaliwala nila yung mga kontrata. So what happened to their contracts? Milyon-milyon yung worth ng contract nila. Anong observation ng court? It cannot stand scrutiny in court. Why? Kasi kulang-kulang yung kanilang mga agreement, no? And their agreement has no legal form because it cannot it did not even have consideration, so it cannot be enforced in court. So doon sila natatalo. They cannot now present to the court the service agreement as their documentation doon sa transactions. So hindi natatanggapin ng korte kasi bakit? Wala siyang consideration for the compensation. In short, hindi siya hindi defined yung obligation doon ng bawat parties, so hindi siya enforceable in court. Okay. Mr. Rogerson testified that he would not allocate any value in an OECD transfer functional analysis to any actual foreign exchange, product liability, or other risks actually borne by the New Angko Barbados as buyer, owner, then seller of the clear out in the transaction in question, even if arm's length parties in the same circumstances would expect to pay and receive a fee for assuming this risk for the other. His reason was that he did not think a functional analysis allowed him to allocate anything to a person he did not believe perform a function. No? So, hindi talaga niya bibigyan si Angko Barbados kasi wala naman daw function na na-perform. He acknowledged that he understood why the court should have trouble thinking a notional arm's length party to these transactions would actually agree to be paid nothing when legally assuming real risk. Yun nga daw, yung di dyan daw niya maisip na yung korte mag-a-assume pa na arm's length yung transaction samantalang yung daw nagpa-function hindi talaga siya binabayaran ng tama and then may risk pa. His explanation was that if there's risk that is associated from anything that is being done, then that's very difficult to price. No? That's the problem here. Of the difference between his functional analysis limited binary choices of 100% and 0 versus what notional real-world arm's length parties would expect, He said to the court that it's your problem to deal with, and I am sorry I can't help you with it more. Nainis na si Mr. Rogerson sa korte, no? Kaya nga siguro lalo na nanalo dito yung AgraCity. Kasi yung expert witness ng Canadian Revenue Agency, na ano na, hindi na, it's your problem daw, sabi niya sa court, no? Mr. Rogerson testified that in his functional analysis, he tested new Agco Barbados and not AgraCity. He looked at the value of the functions performed. Para sa akin, ang presentation lang talaga ng case, yun yung pinaka-importante, no? By and the contributions of new Agco Barbados. His reason was that it was because AgraCity performs much more in the way of functions than new Agco Barbados. And then finding comparables for everything that AgraCity does would be much more difficult than it was so find comparables for the new Agco Barbados does. He went on to say that he had instead tested AgraCity's functions for comparables. He would still expect that AgraCity would be allocated substantially all of the profits from the transaction. Kasi ang contention talaga dito ni Mr. Rogerson na lahat ng profits ng Agco Barbados dapat nandun kay AgraCity, no? At wala kay Agro Barbados kasi si Barbados ginawa lang talaga nilang conduit. Pinangalan lang doon yung transactions, maintain ng bank accounts, lahat ng payments pinasok lang doon. And aside from that, wala na siyang ibang functions, no? In his examination in chief, Mr. Rogerson testified about his main report. He looked at the transactions between AgraCity and New Agco Barbados and the functions performed by it, no? Kasi pag gumawa ka ng transfer pricing analysis report, ganun talagang gagawin mo. Lahat ng functions ng parties involved, no? You have to study. He understood the functions were all performed in AgraCity, not in New Agco Barbados. Correct. His opinion was that New Agco Barbados was not entitled to a return for any functions performed because it did not perform any. No? He understood New Agco Barbados had the contract to buy clear out from arm's length providers and the contract to sell clear out to FNA members. He stated that the services agreement made AgraCity responsible to basically provide all the functions that it required to actually make the transactions happen, to get the product from the arm's length suppliers to the arm's length and users. No? When you look at New Agco Barbados, they don't actually have any employees. They don't perform any functions directly. So obviously, to the extent that they are having things performed for them that are required for the transactions. So we will have to take that into account in pricing the transaction between New Agco Barbados and AgraCity. Okay. Kasi wala naman daw talagang ginawa si Barbados. He stated that in the services agreement, New Agco Barbados doesn't perform any functions. And AgraCity is responsible for essentially all of the functions that are required to get the product sold into Canada to Canadian farmers. His opinion was that a good understanding of how to allocate the value between parties requires one to look at the functions that are performed, take into account the assets that are needed and risks that are associated with using those assets and those functions. He believed New Agco Barbados had no inventory risk because nobody is buying inventory on spec. They always have an order. No? He believed New Agco Barbados had no pricing risk because FNA Group knows its cost of clear out before it gets its price to Canadian farmers. Okay. So, bakit ganito ang mga contention and assumptions ni Mr. Rogerson? Kasi, kung titingnan mo sa transfer pricing, ano ba nangyari dito? Lahat ng company dito, isa lang mukha. Sino lang, kaninong mukha to? Kay Jason Mann at saka kay James Mann. Kasi sila yung mga founders ng lahat ng companies. No? So, in his cross-examination, appellant's counsel put to Mr. Rogerson 3 propositions. Neither AgraCity nor FNA nor any other Canadian entity could lawfully sell clear out to FNA's Canadian members even though a US branch. So ito naman yung contention ng AgraCity, no? In the side of James Mann. Sabi nila, kahit AgraCity pa, kahit ano pang Canadian entity, wala silang license to sell the clear out herbicides sa Canada, no? Kaya ano ginawa ng AgraCity? Delivery lang ang AgraCity. Why? Kasi bawal magbenta ng clear out sa Canada. Ano ang walang license to sell kahit sino pang entity ng clear out sa Canada. Bakit? Kasi hindi sila binibigyan ng permit, no? So bakit nakakarating doon ang clear out sa Canada? Because of the OUI or the on-use import ng bawat farmer. So in short, sino bumibili ng clear out? Yung mga farmers mismo directly to Agco Barbados kasi siya na yung may-ari eh. So anong nangyari dito? Sila na yung nag-i-import ang farmers. So anong contribution dito ni AgraCity? Delivery lang, no? Kaya bakit nangyari ito? Kasi isang tao lang nagpapatakbo dito lahat. AgraCity owned by James Mann. FNA, the Farmers Association founded by James Mann. Yung Agco Barbados also owned by James Mann. Yung US Agco also owned by James Mann. So anong nangyayari dito? Isang tao lang ang nagpapatakbo dito. Pero legally, ito yung mga requirements, no? So walang license to sell yung herbicides, yung clear out sa Canada, no? So sino ang nag-i-import? Yung farmers of North America. Diretso sila nag-i-import sa US. New Agco Barbados actually sourced and negotiated with the arm's length clear out supplier Albo. So sino si Agco Barbados naman? Siya yung negotiate kay Albo, which is the supplier ng herbicides na clear out, para magkaroon sila ng supplies, no? New Agco Barbados effectively had a monopoly on US clear out, having negotiated with Albo a supply agreement for 95% of Albo's production and was actively buying out other available clear out in the US. Biro mo yan, ganun sila powerful, no? Na-monopolize nila yung clear out na herbicide sa US, no? Bakit? Kasi itong si Albo, siya yung 95% na nagpo-produce ng clear out sa US. Ngayon, binili lahat yan ni New Agco Barbados, owned by James Mann, at saan na yan binibenta? Sa Canada, no? Kaya, murang-mura para sa mga farmers. Kasi, sila na yung directly nag-i-import. Mr. Rogerson agreed that if those facts were correct, they do create value in New Agco Barbados. So, ano sabi dito ni Mr. Rogerson? Sabi niya, kung totoo man yun, then, may value yan for New Agco Barbados. And that would have to be looked at in a functional analysis transfer pricing report. That's why sa paggawa ng transfer pricing report, be sure talaga na lahat ng detailed na transactions are properly documented and recorded, no? Kasi talagang tideleskopyohin yan pagdating sa korte. In re-examination, Mr. Rogerson went on to explain that so what's important is that it is now actively sourcing and negotiating with suppliers and that they have somehow locked up the supply of the market, no? So yun na yung sabi nung expert, si Mr. Rogerson. Pero hindi niya masyadong tiningnan na itong mga negotiations na to is done by one person lang, James Mann, using different companies. So if that's the only product that can be brought in through OUI, OUI is on-use import, no? And they've got the suppliers of the product and they're doing the work to negotiate it, then that's what would add the value. So ano na siya na convinced na may value added, may ginagawa din yung Agco Barbados. So the fact that they're doing something and that they have a monopoly, that would give them the ability to add value in the transactions. Why? Because monopoly is an intangible. No? Intangible yan. At ano sabi natin sa intangibles? Intangibles are value added, no? Value added siya. Value creators ng company or ng product. Okay. Value drivers. There was nothing in any of the appellant's expert reports or testimony that could provide material support for the respondent's position that if New Agco Barbados and AgraCity were arm's-length parties, they would have entered into a services agreement on terms and conditions that gave 100% of the clear-out sales profit to AgraCity, no? At hindi rin daw mapatunayan na kung independent transactions man sila, ibigay nila lahat ng profit to AgraCity. no? In that same transaction. And no share whatsoever of those profits to New Angko Barbados, nor did they provide any data. Wala silang comparables, no? Dito natalo yung CRA. Kasi wala silang comparables na ipakita that the same transaction would allow that the profits would be given to AgraCity or in Canada. Information or support that would help establish that the service fees payable to the AgraCity were different than or outside the range of what arms and parties would be expected to provide for. So, hindi nila mapakita na yung independent party, ang gagawin niya, lahat ng profit, bibigay niya kay AgraCity. So, burden of proof, no? So, in House versus the Queen, the Federal Court of Appeal allowed the taxpayers appeal from its loss in our court. In doing so, Nadon J. wrote the following: in determining the issue before us, siya yung judge, no? It is important to keep in mind that the Supreme Court of Canada's decision in Hickman Motors Limited versus Canada, where Madam Justice Juris, hindi ko na alam tong pronunciation, no? Enunciated at paragraph 92 to 95 or of her reasons, the principles which govern the burden of proof in taxation cases. Number 1, the burden of proof in taxation cases is that of the balance of probabilities. Imagine, balance of probabilities yung burden of proof, no? Kasi, pero para sa akin kasi ang tax cases are all factual, no? Hindi mo pwede na probabilities kasi may taxable base tayo eh. With regard to the assumption on which the minister relies for his assessment, the taxpayer has the initial onus to demolish the assumptions. So, ika-counter mo ngayon yung assumptions, no? The taxpayer will have met his initial onus when he or she makes a prima facie case, no? So, yung onus or the burden of proof. Okay. Once the taxpayer has established a prima facie case, the burden then shifts to the minister. Ganun lang yun eh, di ba? Parang laro ng basketball, pasahan lang ng burden of proof. Pag naka-present ka na ng sarili mo, the other will present also the burden of proof na sa kanila na. Who must rebut the taxpayer's prima facie case by proving on a balance of probabilities his assumptions. No? In this case, that Hunt River held at the end of taxation year 2002 a long-term investment of $305,000 which it transferred to the appellant in 2003. If the minister fails to adduce satisfactory evidence, the taxpayer will succeed. Yun lang. Kasi ganun sa korte, dalawa kayong galingan ng bigay ng ebidensya, no? So, kung sino yung may pagkukulang, siyang matatalo, no? Sino yung kumpleto na documentation, siyang mananalo. No? So, in this case, sino yung nanalo dito? The AgraCity. But this is just an appeal case. So, pupunta pa to sa Supreme Court. If the minister fails to adduce satisfactory evidence, the taxpayer will succeed. No? And or the other way around. Kung yung, just like in Coca-Cola, no? Yung mga contention and saka yung evidence ng Coca-Cola, kulang-kulang. So, sino ang nanalo? The IRS, no? Internal Revenue Service. So, more particularly, paragraph 92 and 93 of the reasons in Hickman, Madam Justice L. Juris to explain in clear terms that onus had to be met by the taxpayer at the initial stage. Initial stage pa lang, dapat yung burden of proof na meet na niya. It is trite law that in taxation, the standard of proof is the civil balance of probabilities. No? Dovieco Limited versus Minister of National Revenue. And that within balance of probabilities, there can be varying degrees of proof required in order to discharge the onus depending on the subject matter. No? Continental Insurance Company versus Daltron Cartage Company, 1982. Also Palayan versus MNR, 90 DTC. The minister in making assessment proceeds on assumptions and the initial onus is on the taxpayer to demolish the minister's assumptions in the assessment. No? Kasi in this case, ano yung pinaka-last na issue dito? Yung assessment or adjustment ng income ng AgraCity. The initial onus of demolishing the minister exact assumption is met where the appellant makes out at least a prima facie case. No? In the case at bar, the appellant adduced evidence which met not only a prima facie standard, ang appellant dito, no? But also, in my view, even a higher one. In my view, the appellant demolished the following assumptions as follows. The assumption of two businesses by adducing clear evidence of only one business. Ang gusto dito ng appellant, yung Canadian Revenue Agency, na yung dalawang business ay isang business lang. No? Ano yun? Na yung business ni AgraCity at saka ni Barbados, iisa lang. At gusto nila na yung income ni Barbados ilagay kay AgraCity at si AgraCity ang magbayad ng tax sa Canadian Revenue Agency. In short, walain nila yung Barbados. The assumption of no income by adducing clear evidence of income, the law is settled that unchallenged and uncontradicted evidence demolishes the minister's assumption. See, for example, Isaac versus MNR. No? The Federal Court of Appeals approach in-house was not interpreted by the majority in its later decision, Sarmadi versus the Queen. However, in its concurrent reasons in Sarmadi, we have developed a new and, from my perspective, as a trial judge, preferable approach and interpretation of the developments of the jurisprudence governing the parties' burden of proof and onus in tax cases. The issue of onus in tax cases was recently reviewed by the Federal Court of Appeal in Icebrenner versus the Queen. The appeal from Justice Owen's decision in this court in Morrison versus the Queen, 2018. In Icebrenner, it appears that J.E. Webb, writing the unanimous reason, adopted this dissenting approach in Sarmadi to the parties' onus and burden of proof in the tax court. In Sarmadi, J. Estradas, with whom J.E. Wood concurred on this issue, described J.E. Webb's approach to burden as a thoughtful, illuminating, and attractive articulation of this fundamental issue. Imagine yung kanyang mga description. He went on to invite judges of the tax court to share their useful insights. I commend all of these judges of the Federal Court of Appeal for their efforts to see that the law in this area be reviewed and perhaps evolved. For what it is worth, never in my experience has the Hickman Motors initial onus, prima facie demolished assumptions, or shifting burden gloss on the civil balance of probability standard been necessary or particularly helpful. No? Ito yung sinasabi nila na balance of probabilities. It can almost always be expected to generate much more heat than light in the courtroom. No? Mas marami pa yung malabo kaysa sa yung maliwanag na mga issues. This is not to say I did not try to rely on it when it would help my client or apply it when it could make my reasons more simple. It is the law as set out by the Supreme Court of Canada, and that is binding on me. I applaud all efforts to have it reviewed and would favor an outcome that simply applies the ordinary civil burden and onus of the balance of probability standard in the tax court in the same manner as that standard applies in all other non-criminal trials in Canadian courts. That said, I am mindful that the Hickman Motors approach is expressly grounded in even earlier decisions of the Supreme Court of Canada, and that the Supreme Court of Canada has never clearly and expressly reviewed its Hickman Motors decision, much less clearly overruled it. As a trial judge, I am also mindful of my position in the Fondokian-Bowmanes judicial pecking order. In the Queen versus Craig, the Supreme Court unanimously makes it clear that lower courts are not entitled to disregard or purport to overrule their precedent that is up to the Supreme Court alone. And it can be expected to do that clearly and expressly. So, for these reasons, I am following the Hickman Motors and House line of jurisprudence on the issue. Disposition of appeals. Ito na yung disposition of appeals. Ha? This court has found that the clear-out purchase, sale, and related transactions were not a sham. No? Ito na yung decision niya. Nor was any individual transaction in the series of transactions beginning with the Corporation of New Agco Barbados for the clear out sales activity as sham. No? So, hindi siya maniniwala na deceitful yung incorporate ng New Agco Barbados. The transactions that occurred and were documented were the transactions the parties intended, agreed to, and that the parties reported to others, including the CRA. So any shortcomings in any paperwork was not intended by the appellant or anyone else in the FNA group to deceive the CRA or anyone else. This court has found that in 2005, New Agco US was chosen to be the purchaser and seller of the clear out because it was generally understood by James Mann and by others involved in the FNA group that a non-Canadian entity was required under the OUI program as administered by the PMRA under the PMCA, and that FNA could only promote clear out availability under that program to its members and potential members. So, ang ganda ng pagkagawa nila ng justification, no? Parang, sa akin, yung view ko dito is, parang how do they make around the law, no? Kasi hindi pwede kang magbenta. So, ano yung gagawin mo? Walang license to sell sa Canada. So, anong gagawin mo? Mag-import ka. At ano yung ginawa nila na naka-import sila in the substantial quantity? Gumawa sila ng association ng mga farmers. No? Pero it's an individual farmer. Meron silang permit to import. Okay. Further, I find their understanding was a reasonable one in the circumstances. This understanding was unchanged when New Agco US business was transferred to New Agco Barbados in early 2006. No? So ano yung ginawa ni James Mann? Yung kanyang in-establish na US Agco, nilipat niya sa US, sa New Agco Barbados. New Agco Barbados was the purchaser of the clear out and was the beneficial owner of the clear out, acting on its own account upon purchasing it until it sold the clear out to the Canadian farmers. It was not a holder of a buy-sell contract agent, bear trustee, praetonome, or any form of nominee or nominal title holder. New Agco Barbados paid for its purchases and received the sales proceeds for its own account. Bakit? Kasi ang ginawa dito ni New Agco Barbados, siya yung nagbabayad ng purchases. Siya yung bumibili. That's why yung sales proceeds ng clear out ng commodity, ng inventory na binayaran niya, sa kanya din ang pupunta. Pero kung talagang tutuusin mo, ito si New Agco Barbados, same person lang to eh. No? Si James Mann pa rin to. So New Agco Barbados had sourced all of the relevant US clear out that it had bought and sold. No? So Jason Mann did this on behalf of New Agco Barbados, which had duly authorized him to do exactly that. New Agco Barbados was buying all of the US clear out that it could locate. New Agco Barbados had Jason Mann negotiate an exclusive supply agreement with Albo, which secured New Agco Barbados access to 95%. Imagine, no, yung gaano sila kalaki. Hundreds of trucks ng herbicides ang dinideliver nila sa Canada because 95% ng supplies ng clear out herbicide sa US na nabili nila ni James Mann, no? At ito nga yung ginamit niya na company, itong Agco Barbados, no? So 95% of US clear out manufactured by the only person with the right to manufacture US clear out. Ito yung si Albo, no? Na dati ang may-ari diyan CPT, binili naman ng Albo, no? New Agco Barbados took real foreign exchange risk in the clear out sales. Kasi ang contention or allegations ng Canadian Revenue Agency na si New Agco Barbados wala naman siyang risk, no, in the functions kasi wala naman talaga siyang ginawa. Ang napatunayan ng side naman ni James Mann that the New Agco Barbados have foreign exchange risk. Why? Kasi siya nagbabayad. So, kung ikaw yung nagbabayad and then you are using a foreign currency, meron kang real foreign exchange risk. Why? Kasi sometimes yung currency, yung mode of payment mo, tumataas or bumababa yung exchange rate. So, nagkakaroon ka ng risk. Okay, so in its clear out sales activities, because it was buying and incurring related expenses in US dollars and selling in Canadian dollars, no? So, dalawang currency yan, that's why may foreign exchange risk. Minsan bababa, minsan tataas yung exchange rate. That foreign exchange risk was able to be minimized with respect to the cost of purchasing the US clear out, but not with respect to some of the US transport costs for delivering the clear out once sold to the Canadian farmers. Kasi napatunayan nila na ang contribution talaga dito na AgraCity is delivery. No? Nagdi-deliver lang siya. Or US warehouse cost and other expenses associated with those activities that were performed in the US. So, New Agco Barbados took real risk as owner of large volumes of a chemical-based regulated herbicide applied to food products and as an international transporter of that product to the Canadian farmers. The services agreement is the proper transaction whose terms, rights, and obligations are to be reviewed for purposes of the transfer pricing rules in the Act. Kaya nga, nagtataka ako sa, ito lang ha, kasi hindi pa naman ganun din ka advance yung transfer pricing sa Pilipinas. In my experience, gusto ko reviewin yung mga service agreement ng mga clients. Ayaw ipakita sa akin. And then, in reviewing the services agreement, may nakikita talaga ako doon ng mga provisions na hindi arm's length. No? So, ako naman, anong gagawin ko? Bibigay ko lang yon na recommendation sa management. And then, it's up to the management to ponder or to make some actions to revise their service agreement. As a consultant, wala ka namang ibang gagawin kung hindi recommendation because the management ang may decision, no? Kanila negosyo yan eh. So as a consultant, anong role mo? Just advise them. So kung susundin nila, it's alright. Kung hindi, wala ka rin magawa because the burden is kanila, no? So the findings based on the appellant evidence and the respondent evidence and response thereto clearly make out a prima facie case that the reassessment are incorrect, no? Kaya nga ito yung third issue dito, no, na reassessment at saka adjustment of the income of the Agco Barbados to New AgraCity. So ano sabi ng court? Incorrect and demolishes the respondent assumptions of fact that supported the transfer pricing adjustments that allocated all of New Agco Barbados, no? So net sale profits of approximately $6 million to the appellant. Ang pinag-usapan dito yung $6 million na net profit. This leaves the court having to determine what amount less than all and greater than none, no, of New Agco Barbados net sales profits would have been payable by New Agco Barbados to the appellant for the services provided by AgraCity under the services agreement had they been dealing at arm's length, no? So, kung arm's length daw ang dealings, yung profit na 6 million ng Agco Barbados dapat nasa AgraCity. Pero hindi makahanap daw yung court ng kanilang basis, no? So, the appellant had reported approximately $2 million of service fees. Kasi ang napunta lang sa kay AgraCity, yung 2 million na service fees. Calculated at the agreed 15 and 20 cents. Yung nag-umpisa sila 10 cents lang per liter ang rate ng delivery. Ngayon, ang average is 15 and 20 cents per liter. Earned by it under the services agreement in the period in questions, 2006-2007, no, itong period in question. It is that amount that the reassessment impugn as far too low for the value of the services provided and as an amount far less than arm's length parties would have agreed to. Napakaliit daw ng binabayad sa AgraCity. So the services provided by AgraCity pursuant to the services agreement were largely, though not exclusively, logistical in nature. So ito yung kanilang justification. Logistical in nature lang. Kaya wala ding risk. They were also largely subcontracted by AgraCity to arm's length third parties at arm's length rates. Transportation, warehouse, custom brokers, container, recycling, and disposal. So ito na yung nangyari dito because based on the investigation, yung binabayad ng Barbados na 15 to 20 cents per liter sa AgraCity ay binabayad din niya sa subcontractor niya at arm's length rates, no? So, hindi rin magkakalayo doon sa binabayad sa kanya ng Barbados, no? So, paano mo sasabihin ngayon na ang payment sa kanya is hindi arm's length? Kasi meron mga internal comparables na pinapasubcon niya yung ginagawa niya dito sa transaction na to, pinapasubcon niya sa third parties at arm's length rates, no? So the respondent has chosen not to provide the court with any evidence in support of how to determine any such amount, nor what to base it upon or test it against, no? Sinong respondent dito? The Canadian Revenue Agency. Hindi naman niya sinabi sa court na ito ang sabi nila, hindi arm's length. Pero hindi naman nila maipakita kung ano yung arm's length, no? Kasi ganun ang purpose ng comparables. Bakit? So, sasabihin mo ngayon, itong transaction na to hindi arm's length, that's why dapat kang mag-adjust. Pero ipakita mo naman sa korte na ito yung arm's length. In this case, hindi naman na ipakita ng respondent, the Canadian Revenue Agency, na ito yung dapat. Hindi ito yung ginagawa ng AgraCity. Ito dapat, which is the independent transaction. So, wala silang comparables na maipakita. The respondent instead maintains it must be all of the net sales profits that would have been payable by an arm's length party to AgraCity. The respondent's expert could not offer any help to the court, even after he acknowledged that if New Agro Barbados was the party actually sourcing the U.S. clear out and had secured a quasi-monopoly on supply, those facts would mean that the New Agro Barbados did bring value to the transactions. Oh? So the appellant expert Brad Rolfe, appellant, sino si appellant dito, si AgraCity, meron din siyang expert witness. Si Mr. Rogerson, yung una, expert witness yun ng Canadian Revenue Agency. Ang AgraCity naman, meron din silang expert witness, itong si Brad Rolfe, no? Provided expert opinion evidence in support of the service fee in the services agreement generating revenues for AgraCity. For its services under the services agreement within the arm's length range. Shoutout muna tayo, Hari. May shoutout ba?
Meron po.
Oh, hindi mo sinasabi. Sige, shoutout muna tayo.
Si Sir George Itleong.
Oh, yung mga transfer pricing report, malapit na April. Oh, rini-remind ko na siya Oh, shoutout to you, Sir George. Reminder na rin doon sa mga companies mo. Kasi ang tagal kayo gagawin ng transfer pricing analysis report. Di mo yan pwedeng magawa lang ng 15-30 days, no? Okay, kasi ang tagal pang kumuha ng mga FS sa SEC. Okay, sino pa?
Si Ma'am Liza Jane Tuban. Good evening daw po.
Ma'am Liza Jane Tupan, hindi natin siya participant, no?
Participant mo nung tax preparer.
Sumali siya. Okay, so thank you po. Thank you for watching. Ano pa?
Sila lang po.
O, yung dalawa. So, ilan yung viewers natin ngayon?
6 po.
6, no? Nag-umpisa tayo kanina sa 8, no? Okay. So, ano na nangyari dito? Kasi tapusin natin to ngayon Ilang minutes na tayo?
1 hour 28 minutes.
Oh, so we still have 40 minutes, no? Tapos natin to. Kasi, next, sa Wednesday, ibang case naman yung ating itatakel, no? Ibang case naman. And naghanap kasi ako ng magandang case na hindi pare-pareho ang issue, no? Kasi kung pare-pareho lang, parang hindi mag-diverse yung ating discussion, same lang, no? Kaya maghahanap ako ng ibang issues na maganda siya i-discuss. Okay. So in this case, yung expert witness ng CRA, si Brad Rolfe, he set this out in his rebuttal report to the respondent Rogerson Economic Transfer Pricing Report. Kasi sino na naman yung bigay dito ng kanilang opinion naman, ng opposing opinion, yung expert witnesses, no? Ano naman yung pinresent dito ni Brad Ralph against the report, na transfer pricing report ni Rogerson, no? He explained in his testimony, in essence, Mr. Ralph report look at available data on return, margins, or markups on cost earned by North American corporations that are known to provide broadly similar logistics services, no? So, nag-stick lang talaga sila sa function ng AgraCity, designated function ng AgraCity na logistics. Kaya ano yung binigay nila? Same na company na logistics. Hindi nila kinonsider na may iba pang functions na ini-impute yung Canadian Revenue Agency sa AgraCity, no? He looked in particular at large public corporations, mainly in the US and at large Canadian freight forwarding brokerage and agency companies. Kasi pagdating doon sa bayaran na sa deliveries, ito yung pinakita nila na mga comparables, no? May comparables silang pinakita. Based on these available numbers, such companies would earn in the range of 5 to 15% returns over their cost. The cost-plus method is also recognized in the OECD transfer pricing guidelines and should be considered in the absence of comparable uncontrolled arm's length prices, or the CAP method. So in his rebuttal report, Mr. Ralph calculated AgraCity's return on cost on a comparable basis as approximately 30%. So ano yung nagiging ratio na ginamit nila dito? Yung return on cost, which is doon sa arm's length, doon sa mga ibang logistics providers, 5 to 15% returns over their cost. Ang kay AgraCity is 30%. So mataas. So pasado siya, no? In his testimony, he acknowledged that it would be fair to regard it as more appropriately being about 12% because in his report, he had calculated return on cost after backing out from AgraCity's cost amounts paid by it to FNA, as would be done under the OECD guidelines, whereas the available arm's length data would have been calculated on total cost, including those incurred to non-arm's length parties. So based on this, Mr. Rolfe's opinion was that AgraCity's return were at the higher end of the range of comparable cost, plus return from the available data he could obtain, and that AgraCity's service fee under the services agreement was a reasonable rate of return for its primarily logistics services. So, ang CRA, Canadian Revenue Agency, hindi siya makapakita ng comparable. In the case of the AgraCity, may comparable silang pinakita. At ano yun? Yung mga bayad ng mga logistical support services doon sa similar na transaction. So in short, meron pa silang transfer pricing method na in-apply no, sa OECD, and that is the cost-plus method. So this evidence is clearly not without its limitations. Mr. Ralph himself described it as just a crude benchmarking analysis. No? This, however, the only evidence the court has been given by other party that addresses the ultimate question to be decided under paragraph 2472A and C of whether the amount received by AgraCity from New Agco Barbados for its services relating to the clear-out sales was an amount that would have been payable between arm's length persons for those services. No? So the only evidence the court has on the point indicates that the amount paid to AgraCity generated a return on its cost that was in the range of what somewhat comparable arm's length parties earn. Being the only evidence of what notional arm's length parties would have agreed to for the services provided by AgraCity, it is also by definition the best evidence the court has, notwithstanding its limitations. Kasi wala na eh, wala naman na ibang gagawin, and under the law, yun naman lang din yung dapat na gagawin. If you are doing a transfer pricing analysis, magagawa ka ng comparables. So, nakapag-present ang AgraCity. I conclude that the appellant has met its initial onus to demolish the respondent assumptions as set out by the Supreme Court of Canada in Hickman Motors, and again by the Federal Court of Appeal in-house. The appellant has gone far beyond making out a prima facie case. The respondent has failed to produce satisfactory evidence from its own witnesses on those of the appellant to prove on a balance of probabilities that its relevant assumptions or its further allegations and positions were correct. Therefore, the taxpayer succeed in this appeal. Okay? So, napanalo yung appellant or AgraCity. No? So, even if Justice Webb arguably more attractive, fair, and equitable approach to burden of proof and onus with respect to tax appeals in Sarmadi and Ice-Brenner, where the approach required or chosen to be applied, I would also find for the appellant. No? So, panalo talaga yung AgraCity. The taxpayers provided credible, unchallenged, uncontested, and unrefuted expert evidence based on available data that confirms the amount reported by AgraCity as its profit over the cost of its services to New Angko Barbados was well within the somewhat rough, but in my view, acceptable range of what an arm's length service provider might have enjoyed in circumstances similar to what I have found to be the transactions between New Angko Barbados and AgraCity. No? So, yun po yung sinasabi ng court, no? Yung appeal. And then, meron sila dito na transfer pricing recharacterization. So, transfer pricing adjustment where a taxpayer and a non-resident person with whom the taxpayer does not deal at arm's length are participants in a transaction or a series of transactions. No? So, the transaction or series would not have been entered into between person dealing at arm's length. No? And can reasonably be considered not to have been entered into primarily for bona fide purposes other than to obtain a tax benefit. No? Kaya kailan ka lang daw dapat magkaroon ng transfer pricing adjustment. Kung ang transaction ginawa lang ng mga persons pero hindi siya arm's length. No? At ang purpose lang is to obtain a tax benefit, to lower down the payment of taxes. So any amount that for this section and section 245 would be determined for the purpose of this act in respect of the taxpayer or for a taxation year or fiscal period shall be adjusted. No? Pagka ganun ang ginawa mo, dapat i-adjust yung income to the quantum or nature of the amounts that would have been determined if, where paragraph B applies, the transaction or series entered into between the participant had been the transaction or series that would have been entered into between persons dealing at arm's length under terms and conditions that would have been made between persons dealing at arm's length. So, transfer pricing adjustment where a taxpayer and non-resident person with whom the taxpayer does not deal at arm's length are participants in a transaction or a series of transactions. And ito na, kailan daw magkakaroon ng transfer pricing adjustment. The terms or conditions made or imposed in respect of the transaction or series between any of the participants in the transaction or series differ from those that would have been made between persons dealing at arm's length, or any amounts that, but for this section and section 245, would be determined for the purposes of this act in respect of the taxpayer for a taxation year or fiscal period shall be adjusted. No? So, paano i-adjust? Bawasan mo or dagdagan mo yung income or yung expenses to the quantum or nature of the amount that would have been determined if, where only paragraph A applies, the terms and conditions made or imposed in respect of the transaction or series between the participants in the transaction or series had been those that would have been made between persons dealing at arm's length. So, bakit matatalo yung isang kaso? Because we are talking about dealings at arm's length. Pagkatapos, hindi mo ma-present yung mga persons dealing at arm's length. In short, wala kang comparables na ipapakita. So, hindi ka talaga mananalo sa kaso. Yan yung nangyari dito sa Canadian Revenue Agency because they are, yung allegations nila na hindi arm's length. Pero, wala naman silang mapapakita na comparables na ito yung arm's length. No? So, dapat ganoon sa transfer pricing. Kung ikaw, yung nagsasabi na ang transaction, hindi arm's length, din patunayan mo. Paano mo siya mapatunayan? Mag-present ka ngayon ng comparables na ito yung arm's length at itong under investigation is iba yung ginawa niya. Ito yung dapat, no? Ito yung sa independent parties. Kasi kung wala kang maipakita na ganyan, hindi ka mananalo sa case, no? Okay. So, tapos na tayo, Hari. Anong oras na?
1 hour 40 minutes.
No? So, meron pa tayong 20 minutes. Kasi ang tinapos na lang natin itong AgraCity, the one that we left nung nakaraan. No? So, this is our second day of live streaming dito sa case na to. AgraCity versus Her Majesty, the Queen. No? So, ano nangyari dito? Appeal ito between the AgraCity Ltd. Ang nag-appeal yung AgraCity on the decision ng Canadian Revenue Agency na dapat daw, tatlo yung issue nila dito. Ano dapat? Yung sham transaction na dapat daw wala yung Agco Barbados kasi panggulo lang siya. No? Ang totoo naman nagbi-business yung AgraCity based in Canada. At pangalawa, yung sabi nila na ano yun, may adjustment or reassessment, no, ng case. Dapat daw, ano yung sabi nila dito? Recharacterization of the transaction, no? Ano yung i-recharacterize? Yung transaction ni Barbados, ibigay doon kay AgraCity kasi wala naman daw talagang transaction na ginagawa si Barbados, no? And then yung third, yun na nga yung assessment. Yung assessment, adjustment, na yung kita naman ngayon ni Agco Barbados, dapat daw income yan ni AgraCity. But the beauty of the case is that yung appellant, which is the AgraCity, was able to present, no, an arm's length comparables to show na tama yung ginagawa nila. At yun din yung ginagawa ng mga independent parties. So in this case, since this is just an appeal, pwede pa itong dalhin sa Supreme Court, no, ng Canadian Revenue Agency. Kasi ganun naman ang case. Magmula pa yan sa regular court, mapunta sa appeal, and then yung pinaka-last resort nila is dadalhin mo ngayon sa Supreme Court. No? So, kailan nangyari itong case na to? 2006, 2007 and 2008, no? So, 2 years. 2007 and 2008. Imagine, 2008, 2007, ilang years na to? 14 years na. So, ganyan din po katagal mag-decide ang courts ng cases in transfer pricing. No? Kasi bakit? Maraming issues dito sa transfer pricing cases. Meron ako nabasa isang case na 14 issues. No? So, ilang years yan? Kasi ito, 14 years, tatlong issue lang. No? So, ilang years yan i-decide ng court. Sobrang tagal. No? At saka, ang transfer pricing cases talaga factual. So, anong ibig sabihin ng factual? It's circumstances of the case, talagang proof or the burden of proof. No? Kaya yung onus or the burden of proof, yun talaga yung weight na i-consider ng court. No? Kasi sila din, hindi yan basta madali para sa mga judges din mag-decide ng cases, lalo-lalo na transfer pricing, very technical, hindi nila masyadong alam. Kaya ano na lang ang titingnan nila, yung presentation ng evidence ng bawat isa. O yun lang yung tinitingnan nila doon. Kasi sa nakita ko, even the most controversial transfer pricing cases, also in Canada, yung in the case of GlaxoSmithKline, bakit natalo doon ang GlaxoSmithKline and then nag-concede na lang siya din sa Canadian Revenue Agency and pay, ano yan? And yung, I don't think pala na nagbayad siya, no? Parang nag-appeal din siya doon, yung 3.1 billion na assessment. Kasi talo din siya doon sa documentation at saka meron siyang mga non-compliance. Kaya ang isang case sa transfer pricing, kung compliant yung taxpayers, well-documented, maayos yung documentation, malamang pagdating sa korte, may proof ka na talagang tama at meron ka pang comparables na i-show, no? na ito yung ginagawa ng industry, ito yung performance ng mga players, and then hindi malayo doon yung performance mo, then malamang mananalo ka pa rin pagdating ng sa mga transfer pricing cases. Kaya lang, ang pinakamahirap talaga dyan, yung documentation. Okay, so Harry, wala na shout out?
Si Ma'am Lilia Fernando.
Thank you, thank you. Yung binigay mong ano yun, thank you sa yung chocolate at saka ang daming naka-picture, no? Lahat kami nagpa-picture doon sa binigay mo na bouquet of chocolates, no? Thank you very much. And let's call it a night, no? Thank you very much and see you on Wednesday ulit. Magkakaroon na po tayo ng discussions on another cases ng transfer pricing. Thank you very much and let's call it a night.